It began in the kind of winter Europe no longer expected, one without news, without hurry. The fields had gone pale beneath the frost, and the air carried a taste of old metal. In villages where the church bell still ruled the hours, people spoke of something returning. They said it started with a sound, faint but certain. The dull rhythm of hooves across cobblestone, the creak of harness leather, the jingle of reins brushed by unseen hands. No one ever saw riders, yet everyone described the same pause afterward, the silence that felt like breath held too long. At first, they blamed wind tunneling through alleys, or the uneven stones echoing beneath passing carts. But the sound always came when the streets were empty, long after curfew lamps had burned down. Dogs refused to bark. Windows stayed shut. The smell would follow next. Straw mixed with iron, like stables abandoned too quickly. It drifted through cracks, through keyholes, through sleep itself, reminding those awake of stories told by grandparents, the ones about death riding again. The old said the earth remembers more than men do, that when suffering is great enough, the ground keeps its own heartbeat. So when the hooves were heard again, they called it the land's memory stirring. In one hamlet, a farmer left oats outside his barn, a peace offering for whatever passed. By morning, the bowl was empty, and frost had melted in the shape of 4 perfect hoofprints. No plague had come, not yet. But something invisible began to move through the air, a tension older than fear, quieter than prayer, and as the villagers leaned from their shutters, listening for what wasn't there, the night itself seemed to inhale. In the archives of Florence, where dust softens the sound of footsteps, a historian broke the seal on a forgotten box. The wax crumbled like dried blood. Inside lay a stack of letters wrapped in faded twine, their ink browned by centuries of breath. The top page trembled as he unfolded it. A correspondence dated 1630, written by a parish doctor during the Second Plague. In calm, disciplined script, the writer described a vision on the outskirts of the city. Horsemen made of mist, their shapes half visible in the smoke of burning fields. He wrote that they came before the sickness, like heralds made of air. The historian paused. He had read hundreds of plague accounts, ration logs, death tallies, tax exemptions, but never one written with such certainty. The letter didn't plead for divine help, nor accuse the sick of sin. It simply recorded what was seen, riders with faces covered, passing through the vineyards under a red sun. The document ended abruptly, ink trailing into nothing. He imagined the author setting down his quill as the coughing began. Outside the archive, traffic hummed and tourists murmured. Yet beneath that noise, something else pressed through. The quiet weight of centuries. The historian touched the page again, feeling the texture of fear that had once been real enough to touch. He noted how the handwriting wavered at certain words, as though the writer had looked over his shoulder while writing them. Later that evening, when the lights dimmed and the city closed its shutters, he caught himself listening. The floorboards creaked once, sharply, then stopped. A draft slipped through the window, carrying that same faint smell, iron and straw. He told himself it was coincidence, the mind echoing what it reads. But when he returned to the letter the next day, a faint smudge had appeared on the margin, shaped like the print of a fingertip still wet from ink. In Avignon, the church stood where it always had, its stone walls weathered smooth by wind and confession. Most nights it was empty, save for the cold shimmer of candle stubs and the echo of pigeons nesting in the rafters. But one evening the bells began to ring. No hands pulled the ropes, no figures stood beneath the tower, still. The sound rolled through the streets, slow, uneven, as if the air itself remembered the motion. The priest, an old man with joints stiff from decades of kneeling, climbed the narrow stairs to see for himself. The ropes swung gently, brushing against one another, their fibers dark with age. He touched one, expecting resistance, but it moved as though pulled from above. The bells answered again, 3 measured tolls that lingered too long in the frozen night. He whispered a prayer, more out of habit than faith, and wrote later in the parish log, "They toll for those not yet taken." By morning, the town spoke of it in hushed tones. Some said it was wind caught in the tower's hollow. Others said it was a warning, the same one their ancestors once heard before the plague entered the valley. The priest locked the belfry and forbade anyone to climb again, yet each night, just past the 2nd hour, the faintest tremor would shudder through the ropes. Outside, the river ran black beneath the moon, carrying driftwood, and the reflection of the bell tower's cross. The sound of those phantom tolls grew softer over the following weeks, until they were almost imagined, like a heartbeat fading into distance. Still, the villagers claimed that if you stood by the water and listened long enough, you could hear one final ring, stretched thin through time, waiting for its echo to return. The chronicles never agreed on the year it began, only that the sound came first. 4 riders, each described differently yet always arriving together, appeared in the margins of medieval memory. Monks recorded them in trembling Latin, soldiers in broken French, mothers in diaries that survived only as fragments. One wrote that the riders came beneath a moon so pale it looked sick. Another said the earth shook, not with thunder, but with breath. Always 4, always silent. The chroniclers gave them colours. White for fever, red for the coughing of blood, black for the swelling beneath the skin, and pale for the quiet that followed. In every account, the 4th came last, moving slow, as if reluctant to arrive. To later generations, they became the 4 Horsemen of Revelation, symbols of divine punishment. But in those years they were not symbols. They were explanations. The people of Europe had no science to name what crawled through their cities, no understanding of air or decay, so they gave death a face, a mount, a purpose. The writer of the Chronicle of Rouen recorded that when the riders passed, crops bent in their wake, and milk soured in the pail. The annals of Siena told of hooves that left no marks but echoed for days in men's dreams. These were not allegories. They were coping mechanisms carved into parchment. And yet, within those same pages, there is something softer, a strange reverence. The riders are never described as cruel. They are precise, unhurried, almost dutiful, as though death itself understood fairness better than life ever did. Centuries later, historians would dismiss these accounts as superstition. But perhaps that misses the point. The riders were never meant to frighten. They were meant to explain the inexplicable, to give shape to the silence that followed every cough. In the northern port city of Lübeck, a mural hides behind layers of soot and plaster, a painting known only to the archivists who restored it after the war. It stretches across a church wall once called the Dead Gate, the place where bodies were carried out when the plague had filled the nave. Time has softened the colours, but not their intent. 4 riders gallop above rooftops, each cloaked in robes of grey and ash. Below them, the town sleeps in miniature, its streets rendered with aching precision, every window closed, every door sealed tight. When the restoration began, the conservators noticed something unusual in the pigment. The black wasn't entirely mineral. It carried traces of calcium, phosphorus, and carbon unlike any known paint base. Later testing revealed what the old masters had never recorded. Ashes of the dead had been mixed into the pigment. The mural was not merely a depiction of the plague. It was part of it. The people who perished had become the colour of their own memory. Standing before it, one senses no fear, only stillness. The horses seem suspended in mid-motion, their hooves brushing roofs without disturbing a single tile. The faces of the riders are blurred, neither skeletal nor human, their forms lost in the fog of centuries. Some restorers swore that under certain light the eyes seemed to shimmer faintly, as if wet. No one signs a work like this. It belongs to everyone who survived and everyone who didn't. The wall remains unlit except during guided visits. Tourists lower their voices instinctively as though the sound might wake something. Outside, the sea wind hums through narrow streets, carrying salt, dust, and the faint scent of lime wash. It smells of age, of prayers, and of something once burning that refuses to fade. Across Europe's royal courts, the plague arrived not as a scream, but as a rumour carried by servants. By the time it reached the king's chambers, it had already filled the city below. In Paris, they burned herbs in golden bowls, their smoke coiling through corridors like incense for invisible guests. In Prague, guards painted horse symbols on palace gates to ward off what they called the breath riders. The superstition spread faster than the sickness itself, a contagion of belief. Letters between monarchs spoke in cautious language. They never named the plague directly, only the air, or the tide, or the pale season. One queen wrote that she could smell death through the marble. Another ordered her mirrors covered, claiming reflections carried contagion. Even as physicians advised restraint, fear disguised itself as ritual. Courtiers placed sprigs of rosemary beneath their tongues during speeches. Priests swung censers in endless circles, their faces hidden behind veils soaked in vinegar. In London, a chronicler noted that the king refused audiences for 50 days. His meals left at the threshold of his room. He slept surrounded by candles arranged in a ring, a circle of fire to hold back what none could see. The servants whispered that he prayed not for survival, but for delay. Each morning, he asked if the bells had begun tolling in the city. Each night, he listened for hooves beyond the walls. When the plague passed, statues were erected to honor divine mercy, but the riders remained etched in the margins of royal journals. Small sketches of horses in the corner of prayer books, hooves drawn mid-motion. Fear had moved faster than infection, crossing borders with the same precision as diplomacy. In their need to control the unseen, kings had learned what peasants already knew. Death does not bow. It only pauses between kingdoms. Early physicians spoke of the plague as though it moved like water, flowing unseen through streets, pooling in low air, drifting with the wind. They called it miasma, the bad air. To them, sickness had weight and direction. It clung to corners, hovered above wells, slipped beneath doors like fog seeking rest. They mapped these invisible rivers with candles and smoke, trying to trace where the next tide of death would rise. In the narrow lanes of Venice, watchers stood at crossroads, studying how the smell changed with each gust. They swore the wind carried whispers, that the sound of it thickened before new cases appeared. The plague was not just disease, it was presence, something that breathed differently. Merchants hung damp cloths over their windows, believing the wet fabric would catch what the air concealed. Mothers buried herbs in the thresholds of their homes, praying the scent might confuse whatever spirit hunted breath. Centuries later, their methods seem naive, yet strangely human. The attempt to chart the unseen revealed a deeper truth. People needed to believe that death obeyed a pattern, that it flowed where one could at least imagine a current. In monasteries, monks recorded weather patterns beside mortality lists. They noted which way the smoke bent during prayer, which alley held the stench the longest, and when the winds finally shifted, they said the sickness had followed. Modern science would prove them wrong, but not entirely. Air does carry more than we understand. Dust, pollen, fragments of the past that settle on our skin like quiet reminders. In those years, the people of Europe learned to watch the movement of nothing. To them, the plague was a river without water, a tide without sea, and the living stood like islands within its flow, breathing, waiting, hoping the current might pass them by. They said the sound came before the smell, the slow grind of wood and iron wheels, the rasp of ropes pulling weight through narrow streets. The plague carts moved at dawn, when light was too thin to show colour. Men wrapped in layers of cloth trudged beside them, faces hidden, breaths shallow. Their task was simple: gather the bodies before the city woke. Yet every morning, one cart returned lighter than it had left. The men said it was the air stealing from them. One of them, a labourer named Orso, kept a record on scraps of parchment. He wrote of the silence that came when the cart stopped moving. The air would press down, thick enough to taste, carrying a faint sweetness of decay mixed with vinegar. It is the stillness that kills, he wrote, not the plague. He noticed that when wind moved, they stayed healthy. When nights were calm and the air hung heavy, men fell coughing by morning, so they began to fear silence itself. After weeks of work, Orso swore he heard something beneath the creak of the wheels, a rhythm, soft and steady, like hooves pacing beside them. The others laughed until they too began to hear it. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never seen. When the coughing worsened, they left their carts unburied and fled toward the fields. The sound followed for a while, then faded into the wind. By the time the next cart arrived, only empty streets remained. The logs note no uprising, no theft, no violence, just absence, as if the air had gathered them whole. Centuries later, historians would call these stories delusions, auditory artifacts of fear. Yet in the margins of Orso's notes, faintly inked between the lines, was a single sentence: "When the silence walks, hold your breath." In a dim Florentine workshop, lit only by angled sunlight, a physician named Matteo Alighieri spent his life chasing a pattern in the darkness. He believed the plague moved with the shadows, that death followed the shape of light as it bent across stone. Each morning he marked the walls with thin charcoal lines, recording where the sun struck and how long it lingered. By evening, he compared his maps to the city's death rolls, convinced that the longer a shadow lay still, the faster sickness spread there. To his peers, Matteo was both brilliant and broken. While others searched for herbs or divine favour, he charted geometry, measuring despair with a compass and thread. His apprentice wrote that Matteo spoke to the light as if it were a language. "Every ray carries a story," he would say. "It tells us where the dying will stand." The maps he left behind resemble constellations, inked intersections of sunlight and loss. Some lines end abruptly, as though the pen fell when the coughing began. When the authorities sealed Florence's gates, Matteo moved his experiments indoors. He placed mirrors opposite the sickbeds, watching how the reflected glow dimmed when breath grew shallow. He believed the plague dimmed light itself, feeding on brightness. His final entry reads, "There is a color the living cannot see, the shade between gold and dust. When it touches you, the body forgets its own weight." Years later, his papers were found sealed in wax, their edges blackened by candle flame. Scholars dismissed them as madness, yet could not deny their beauty. The drawings glowed faintly where graphite caught the light, a map of human fear rendered in perfect symmetry. Matteo never cured the plague, but in his devotion, he revealed something profound, that even in dying the human mind seeks order, searching for light's reason inside the dark. It began with a rumor whispered among the tram conductors of Prague in the winter of 1938. An empty car, they said, glided through the city long after the power had been cut, its windows fogged, its lamps faintly glowing. No passengers were ever seen inside, yet the wheels rang clear against the rails, echoing like hooves on old stone. The tram never stopped, never took a route marked on any schedule. It appeared only on nights when the fog thickened enough to erase distance, and vanished where the river curved beneath the bridges. At first, officials dismissed it as nerves. The city was tense, rumors of war already trembling through the air. But the stories persisted. A night watchman swore he saw the tram's number, 313, etched faintly into the mist. Another claimed the doors opened by themselves as he passed, releasing a smell of iron, straw, and something faintly sweet, like old smoke. Within days, typhus spread through the nearby district. No one connected the two at first, not publicly, but old women began to place salt lines on the tram tracks, muttering that death had found a new carriage. A newspaper finally reported it under the headline "Phantom Tram in Old Town." The article vanished from print the next day. The authorities cited superstition. Yet that night, when the city's sirens tested their alarms, the sound matched the tram's faint hum in pitch. People took it as a warning. The riders had changed their shape, trading horses for engines, reins for cables. Decades later, a conductor repairing the line found an old rusted bell beneath the tracks, its clapper missing, its metal blackened by time. No record showed it had ever belonged to tram 313. He took it home, cleaned it, and hung it by his door. Some nights, when the fog drifts low over the river, it still rings once, softly, as though signaling that the route continues. In the spring of 1954, a Parisian photographer named Etienne Moreau set up his camera beneath a street lamp on Rue des Ursulines. He was testing a new long-exposure technique meant to capture the hush of fog at dawn. The city slept behind curtains of mist, its rooftops half drowned in grey. When he developed the negatives that evening, he found streaks that shouldn't have been there, curving trails of pale light bending through the frame like motion caught too slowly. They formed the faint outline of hooves. He assumed it was an error, dust on the lens, perhaps a trick of the gaslight. But in each photograph, the same pattern returned. 4 arches of light, blurred mid-motion, their angles too even to be random. On the 5th plate, the pattern changed. Between the streaks, a shape emerged, a hint of a face turned toward the lens, not fully formed, but unmistakably watching. Etienne stored that negative in a sealed envelope and stopped taking night photographs altogether. Years later, his daughter found the images after his death. The negatives had aged strangely, the film's edges tinted faintly red. The shadows within deepened, as though time itself had darkened them. Experts called it chemical decay, yet those who viewed the plates in person reported something peculiar. When held under light, the blurred lines seemed to shift, their glow pulsing faintly. Like breath, a museum eventually acquired the collection. They displayed the images under glass in a dim corridor, each accompanied by a placard explaining the technique, never the legend. But visitors often described a strange hush settling over them as they walked past, the sound of their own footsteps fading sooner than expected. Some swore they heard a faint metallic jingle, as if reins brushed against stone. None of them knew what tram 313 was, nor why the curator chose to play a recording of distant hooves on a loop. In a handful of small villages scattered across southern Poland, the churches still close their doors on certain nights. No one speaks of it directly. They simply say, "It is not a night for prayer." Outsiders think it's an old superstition, another remnant of peasant folklore. But to the locals, it's tradition born of memory. The ritual is quiet. At dusk, the caretaker sweeps the threshold, sprinkles a circle of salt, and locks the heavy wooden door with a single turn. Candles are left burning inside, their glow leaking faintly through stained glass like watchful eyes. The story behind it has no written record, only retellings. They say that during the Great Plague of the 1600s, riders passed through one such valley each spring, unseen but always heard. The hooves came down from the mountains, circled the church, then faded into the night. Each time, those who had watched from their windows fell ill within a week. The priest of that era ordered the church sealed after sunset, claiming that faith should never invite what wanders. Since then, every generation has kept the practice alive. Modern priests tolerate it, though they call it symbolic. Yet each year, the night before All Saints' Day, the locks are checked twice. Those who live nearby swear they still hear movement inside, wood creaking, iron hinges settling, a soft rhythm that matches the pace of breathing. No one opens the doors to see. By dawn, the candles have burned out on their own, the air inside warm and faintly metallic, as if touched by unseen hands. Visitors often ask why such rituals persist in an age of reason. The caretakers smile and shake their heads. Because some doors, they say, remember who tried to enter. And as the sun rises over the empty square, the church stands silent, its locked doors facing east, waiting for the light to arrive first. By the time the last great plague faded from Europe's memory, the riders had vanished from its skies, cities rebuilt, fields returned to green, and the sound of hooves became only history, something told by grandfathers when the lamps burned low. Yet everywhere the plague had passed, stone and bronze preserved its echo. On fountains and archways, sculptors carved horses frozen mid-gallop, their muscles tense, their eyes hollow but calm. They were no longer harbingers of death. They were guardians of survival. In Vienna, a statue stands near the old infirmary. A rider leaning back on his reins, one hand extended as if steadying the wind. The inscription beneath reads simply, "He did not stop the plague, but he did not run." Scholars call it allegory. The people call it memory. Across centuries, that pose of restraint became a kind of forgiveness. The terror of the old riders had been tamed, their motion caught in the moment before destruction. Artists continued to paint them, but the tones changed. No longer black and red, but silver and ochre, colours of morning instead of dusk. Churches commissioned frescoes, where the riders turned their horses away from towns, disappearing into clouds of gold leaf. Death, they said, had learned mercy. In truth, it was the living who had changed. Having endured what felt eternal, they began to shape their fear into beauty, an instinct as old as grief itself. Even the bells that once tolled for the doomed began ringing in celebration, of survival, of breath, of morning light returning through stained glass. Yet in those same tones, if one listened carefully, something older still lingered, a rhythm faint as a remembered heartbeat. Because memory does not die when death does. It simply changes form, waiting for another age to give it a name again. In museums across Europe, the sound of hooves has become an exhibit. Audio installations recreate them in dim rooms lined with stone, each echo timed to fade just before the next begins. Visitors close their eyes and listen as the rhythm circles them, slow, deliberate, impossibly distant. For some, it stirs unease. For others, nostalgia. The sound belongs to no one, yet it carries the weight of all who once listened to it in fear. In one installation in Krakow, the curator used ground limestone to coat the floor, so every step leaves a pale print that vanishes after a few minutes. Children walk through it laughing, unaware that the dust on their shoes was meant to mimic the streets once scrubbed after plague carts passed. At the centre stands a bronze bell cracked down one side, salvaged from a church that burned during the cholera years. When the recording ends, the bell is struck once, not for mourning, but remembrance. An old woman visiting the exhibit once told the staff she felt something move through her as the hooves slowed. "It wasn't fear," she said softly. "It was like the sound recognized me." The staff smiled, assuming metaphor. but her words captured something essential. History does not speak in language. It travels in rhythm. What we inherit from the dead is not their suffering, but their pulse. Every culture that endured plague found a way to listen for it. The faint echo that outlives disaster. It moves through architecture, through music, through the quiet between words. In those moments, the riders are not ghosts or myths, but memory itself, circling through generations, touching each briefly before passing on. And when the sound finally fades, what remains is the silence that follows. Not absence, but peace. There is a map kept in a private collection in Bruges, stitched rather than drawn. Its thread traces the path of the plague through Europe. Black silk for cities lost, grey for those that survived. Between them, faint gold lines connect the places where witnesses once swore they heard riders in the sky. No name identifies the maker. The linen smells faintly of smoke and lavender, like something once folded against a dying chest. When spread across a table, the map looks less like geography and more like memory. A web of quiet intersections, looping endlessly toward the horizon. Every gold thread ends in a knot, each one tied by hand. Under magnification, you can see where a drop of blood has darkened the fabric, small and unintentional, but present. Historians treat it as evidence of accident. Others believe the maker pricked their finger with each stitch, offering a piece of life to mark where death once passed. The map's owner allows it to be viewed only in silence. No commentary, no guided tour. Visitors stand around it, breathing softly, the room dim except for a single lamp hung low to mimic candlelight. In that glow, the threads shimmer faintly, as if the roots themselves are still alive, moving beneath the surface. For a moment, Europe breathes again. Streets filling, bells tolling, wind carrying the scent of straw and smoke. When the lamp is finally turned off, the room returns to darkness, and the map disappears into it completely. No one ever sees it folded away. Some claim it hums faintly when the last light dies, a whispering fabric tracing itself back through time. Perhaps the riders never left. Perhaps they were never meant to. Maybe history only changes saddles, waiting for another century to hear its hooves again.